The ceremony was supposed to be the absolute culmination of her existence. Instead, it became the exact moment her entire world shattered. Everin Eld stood perfectly still on the lower step of the grand day. The immense stonework of the Oakhaven throne room pressed down around her, heavy with centuries of southern pride and suffocating heat. Torches blazed along the high stone walls, casting a thick golden light over the assembled nobility. The air in the hall was saturated with the smell of roasted venison, spiced wine, and the nervous, sour sweat of 300 lords and ladies waiting for a coronation. The heat of the massive hearth fires roared against the stonework, creating an oppressive atmosphere that made drawing a full breath nearly impossible. They were waiting for their king to claim his fated mate. Robert Vance stood above her on the highest tier. He wore the crimson velvet of his station, a heavy gold crown resting upon his brown hair, the metal catching the torchlight in sharp burning flashes. But the man beneath the finery was trembling. It was a subtle vibration, a slight twitch in the fingers of his left hand. But Everin saw it. She had always seen him clearly. Robert was weak-willed, a ruler obsessed with the fragility of his own status, driven by the desperate need to appease the powerful noble houses rather than trust the bond that ancient ancestral fate had given them. His mud-brown eyes darted everywhere, toward the heavy oak doors, banded in iron, toward the arched windows that looked out over the southern valley, toward the intricate tapestries depicting centuries of Oakhaven's victories, but never toward her face. He could not look at the woman he was about to destroy. A heavy, unnatural silence swallowed the room. The murmurs died. The musicians lowered their lutes. The temperature in the hall seemed to drop, though the flames roared on. Then, the side door of the royal chambers opened. The heavy iron hinges groaned, a sound that seemed to slice straight through the tension in the room. Clara Sterling stepped into the light. The noblewoman moved with the cold, calculated grace of a predator who had already secured her kill. She was draped in shimmering silver silk that pooled around her feet like liquid moonlight, her dark hair woven with diamonds that caught the torchlight like spidery patterns of ice. As she descended the stone steps toward the king, a suffocating wave of her scent flooded the space. It was crushed jasmine and bitter honey, a smell steeped in raw ambition. Clara Sterling did not look at the crowd. She kept her gaze fixed on the monarch, her lips curved into a sharp, frozen smile that held absolutely no warmth. Robert reached out. He took Clara's hand. Everin's inner wolf slammed violently against her ribs. A phantom blade of pure ice drove itself directly through her chest, twisting mercilessly. The biological agony of the fated mate bond being actively rejected was not a metaphor. It was a physical tearing of tissues, a brutal severing of the soul, a sacred thread woven between their spirits, stretching, tearing, bleeding. Her breath hitched. The blood in her veins turned to lead, heavy and freezing. Her vision blurred at the edges, tunneling down to the sight of Robert, intertwining his fingers with another woman. The golden light of the hall seemed to dim, replaced by the crushing weight of profound, inescapable humiliation. "People of Oakhaven," Robert announced. His voice was overly loud, straining to project authority over his own internal panic. "The strength of our southern borders requires an alliance of absolute power. It requires a queen with a dominant wolf, an heir of impeccable lineage." He finally forced his gaze down to the woman's, standing alone on the lower steps. Everin Eld possesses no inner beast that can defend this realm. She is a wolfless omega, unsuited for the weight of the crown. The words struck the stone floor like lead weights. Therefore, the king continued, gripping Clara Sterling tighter. "I reject this bond. I take Clara Sterling as my chosen Luna." The nobility held their collective breath. Hundreds of eyes shifted to Everin. They expected the inevitable. They waited for the Omega to shatter. They waited for the tears, the collapse, the pathetic begging of a low-status woman who had dared to reach for a throne above her station. Clara Sterling's smile widened just a fraction, anticipating the sweet nectar of public humiliation. But Everin did not cry. She did not beg. She did not lower her head. The young woman simply lifted her chin. The agony inside her chest was screaming, an inferno of severed magic burning her nerves to ash, but she locked it away behind a fortress of sheer, unbreakable stoicism. Her spine remained perfectly straight. Her expression was a calm, unreadable mask. Slowly, deliberately, she reached for her left hand. She gripped the delicate golden ember betrothal ring he had given her in the quiet woods a year ago. Back when he had sworn that love was stronger than politics. The metal felt remarkably cold against her feverish skin. She slid it past her knuckle. "Iverin," Robert whispered, the strange acoustics of the silent room carrying his sudden, weak hesitation. "You must understand, it is for the kingdom." She didn't answer him. She simply extended her arm and opened her fingers. The ring dropped. It hit the polished stone floor with a sharp, singular clink that echoed off the vaulted ceiling. In the exact moment, the gold severed contact with her skin, the massive hearth fires along the walls inexplicably dimmed. A sudden, unnatural chill leached straight into the stonework beneath their feet, the ancient magic of the southern kingdom instantly recoiling as it lost its true anchor. The ring rolled twice, then spun to a stop directly at the base of the throne. It was the shattered ring, the physical remnant of a broken promise, the very jewel that Robert immediately bent to retrieve, and with trembling hands, presented to Clara to solidify his new hollow alliance. "I accept your rejection, King Robert," Iverin said. Her voice was not loud, but it carried a strange, resonant frequency that made the nearby guards flinch. Clara Sterling's smile tightened into a thin line of annoyance. She leaned closer to the monarch, whispering something in his ear. Iverin recognized the predatory glint in the other woman's eye, a creature beautiful the way a blade was beautiful. The subterranean vaults beneath the keep were reserved for those the crown wished to permanently erase. Clara Sterling was ambitious and cold, and she would never tolerate the existence of the king's true fated mate walking freely within the castle walls. By morning, there would be whispers of treason. By noon, Iverin would be dragged into the lightless, damp cells beneath Oakhaven, locked in iron and left to rot so the new royal couple could sleep without guilt. She would not let them take her freedom. She would not become a ghost in her own home. Without waiting for dismissal, the dark-haired woman turned on her heel. Her simple skirt swished against the stone. "Wait," Robert called out, a sudden tremor of panic lacing his tone. He had expected her to fall to her knees. He had expected to play the merciful lord, offering her a place in the servants' wing. Her absolute silence terrified him. Guards, do not let her leave. Iverin did not break her stride. She walked straight down the center aisle. The crowd of nobles instinctively parted, stepping back from the sheer, freezing intensity radiating from her small frame. No one dared to touch her. No one raised a spear. She pushed through the heavy oak doors of the grand hall. The heavy thud of the wood, closing behind her, severed the golden light, plunging her into the dim, draughty corridor of the outer keep. The scent of roasted meat and sweet wine vanished, replaced instantly by the stark metallic smell of cold iron and burning torch pitch. Her wolf whimpered, a low, pathetic sound of absolute grief. "Quiet," Iverin commanded her inner beast. "We mourn later. Now we survive." She took the first corridor to the left, moving with rapid, silent steps down the narrow stairwell, past the kitchens where the heat of the massive ovens blasted against her skin for a fleeting second, and out through the heavy iron grate of the scullery exit. The cold night air hit her face like a physical blow. The southern kingdom of Oakhaven was rarely touched by deep freezes, but tonight the wind carried a bitter, stinging edge that seemed to mock the warmth she had just lost. The sky above was a canvas of bruised purple and pitch black, devoid of stars. Iverin pulled the thin fabric of her cloak tighter around her shoulders. She did not look back at the towering stone spires of the castle. She did not look back at the life she had been promised. Setting her eyes on the jagged silhouette of the northern mountain range, she slipped silently into the surrounding woods. Through the remainder of that first night, Iverin moved like a phantom through the thick underbrush. The manicured gravel paths of the royal estate gave way to rough forest tracks, and then to absolute wilderness. She forced her body forward through the dark, driven by adrenaline and the raw instinct to put as much distance between herself and Oakhaven as possible. The woods were a labyrinth of gnarled roots and thorny underbrush that snagged at her simple skirts, tearing the fabric and scratching her skin, but she did not slow her pace. The agony of the severed mate bond burned in her core like a low-grade fever, draining her physical stamina, making her teeth chatter uncontrollably in the dark. When dawn broke on the second day, Ivorin did not stop to rest in the open. She sought shelter beneath the hollowed roots of an ancient oak, curling her small frame into the damp earth while southern border patrols thundered past on the main road a quarter-mile away. She nursed herself with small sips of stream water and hard crusts of bread scavenged from her room, keeping her ears strained for the sound of pursuing hooves. By the third day, the dense southern woodland began to thin, replaced by rocky, windswept foothills. The air grew perceptibly colder, stripped of the humid warmth of the valley below. Ivorin navigated by the harsh terrain, picking her way across boulder-strewn gullies and icy streams. Her limbs felt heavy as lead, her muscles aching with every step, but the silence of the wilderness was her only ally. She knew Robert's men would be searching the southern towns and eastern roads, assuming a disgraced wolfless Omega would seek refuge among common villagers. They would not expect her to climb into the barren high country. By the fourth day of her relentless flight, the gentle, fertile slopes of Oakhaven lay far behind her, replaced by the jagged, unforgiving ridges of the mountain pass. The climate turned brutal. The sky bruised to the color of iron as a sudden winter blizzard swept down from the high peaks without warning. The temperature plummeted so rapidly that the moisture on Iverin's eyelashes froze into tiny crystals. The wind shrieked through the narrow chasms, whipping hard, biting granules of ice against her face that stung like tiny needles. It was a cold unlike anything the southern kingdom ever produced, a lethal, suffocating frost that seeped straight through her thin wool cloak and settled deep into her marrow, threatening to extinguish the last flickering embers of her life. Her body was failing. The biological shock of the severed bond had stripped away her natural resistance, leaving her shivering violently with every breath. Worse, the jagged shale and frozen rocks took a brutal toll on her footwear. The delicate leather of her riding boots, crafted for polished palace floors and garden strolls, could not endure the savage punishment of the mountain trail. On the fourth afternoon, the soles tore completely open, disintegrating into useless scraps against the razor-sharp ice. Ivorin was forced to walk barefoot across the frozen earth. Every step was an agony that seized her lungs. The frozen stone sliced into her heels and toes, tearing her soft skin to ribbons. She pushed forward, leaning heavily against the sheer, icy rock faces of the canyon to keep herself upright. Her raw hands left streaks of red on the frost. She left a dark crimson trail of bloody footprints in the pristine white snow behind her, a tragic map of her suffering painted across the barren landscape. Far behind her, echoing down the chasm through the howling storm, a sound shattered the quiet, a hunting horn, long, low, and vibrating with malicious intent. Ivorin froze, her hand gripping an icy ledge as her heart hammered violently against her ribs. Robert Vance had realized what her quiet escape truly meant. Her dignified silence had not been submission. It was a scathing, public rejection of his authority. His fragile pride could not bear it. He needed to drag her back to prove his absolute control, and to hunt her down, he had unleashed his most ruthless tracker, Garrett Finch. The lead huntsman was a merciless predator who treated hunting not as a duty, but as a bloody art form. He commanded a pack of iron-jawed bloodhounds, bred specifically to run down rogue wolves across any terrain. Garrett Finch would not offer mercy. He would drag her back by her dark hair, broken and bleeding, a prize to be displayed before King Robert and Clara Sterling. Another horn blast sounded, closer this time, followed by the terrifying echoing baying of hounds catching a fresh scent. They had picked up her blood trail in the snow. Ivorin bit down on her lip until she tasted copper, refusing to give voice to the panic rising in her throat. She dragged herself forward, her bare, bleeding feet numbing to the point where she could no longer feel the ground, moving only by sheer, unyielding force of will. The biting winds sought to push her back down the mountain, back into the hands of her abusers, but she kept her spine straight, even as she crawled over the final jagged rocks. On the fifth evening, at dusk, as the bruised purple light of twilight faded behind the storm-choked peaks, Ivorin reached the edge of the world. Before her, the mountain path ended abruptly at a massive sheer drop. Spanning the terrifying abyss was an ancient, frost-rimed structure of dark, carved stone, the stone bridge of Ashenir. It was the ancient, undisputed boundary separating the southern kingdom of Oakhaven from the frozen northern wastes of Ashenir. The wind roared through the gorge below, threatening to tear her from her feet. Ivorin stumbled onto the bridge, her bare, torn feet leaving dark crimson smears against the white frost of the flagstones. She paused, swaying precariously, her vision tunneling down to darkness as her body reached its absolute limit. Through the blinding veil of snow, she caught a scent. It cut through the sterile smell of ice and ozone. It was rich, deep, and intoxicatingly warm, the aroma of crushed northern pines, wood smoke, and dark ancient earth. It was a scent that commanded absolute stillness, carrying a primal protective weight that made her trembling soul freeze in place. A silhouette separated itself from the massive stone pillars on the far side of the bridge. Tall, broad. A figure imposing enough to command the mountain itself, radiating an aura of ancient, untamed power. He was draped in a massive wolfskin cloak, its heavy obsidian fur infused with that intoxicating pine scent, absorbing the faint, ghostly light of the rising moon and shielding him completely from the savage wind. Beside him, standing silently in the shadow of the bridge arch, was his scout Jarek Thorn, his hand resting calmly on the pommel of his blade as he surveyed the boundary with predatory stillness. The man in the center of the bridge did not flinch against the violent gale. His storm-grey eyes locked onto her trembling form through the blizzard. Ivorin didn't know the man watching her from the stone archway was King Nikolai Valerius. She didn't know he had spent years listening to the shifting winds of the northern border, waiting for the corrupt foundations of the south to fracture. And she certainly didn't know that crossing this threshold would bind her fate to a sovereign who ruled not through terror, but through unyielding strength and patience. All she knew was that her muscles were freezing solid. The hounds were screaming behind her, and the powerful sovereign standing in the snow was the only barrier between her and total destruction. A sudden, violent vibration shuddered through the frost-rimed stone of the bridge. The ferocious baying of Garrett Finch's bloodhounds echoed off the sheer canyon walls, erupting onto the summit path. The sound was a jagged, visceral tear through the howling symphony of the winter blizzard, vibrating with a raw, predatory hunger that made the fine hairs on the back of Iverin's neck stand on end. It was not merely the noise of animals on a hunt. It was the acoustic manifestation of southern cruelty, the desperate echo of Robert Vance's fragile ego made manifest in teeth and muscle, demanding the violent return of his discarded possession. The hounds were close. The deep, guttural barks echoed off the sheer canyon walls, amplifying the absolute terror of their approach. Ivorin stood at the southern threshold of the stone bridge of Ashenir. The wind whipped her torn, simple skirts around her frozen legs, the thin, ruined fabric offering absolutely no protection against the lethal northern gale. Her breathing had devolved into a series of shallow, agonizing gasps. Every inhalation felt like swallowing handfuls of crushed glass. Her lungs burned, starved for oxygen in the thin, freezing altitude of the high country, while her pulse hammered a frantic, irregular rhythm against her collarbone. She looked down at her feet. Her delicate leather riding boots were gone, shredded miles ago by the unforgiving razor-sharp shale of the lower mountain pass. Now, her bare soles were pressed directly against the frost-rimed flagstones of the ancient bridge. The pain was beyond conventional agony. It was a deep, blinding white heat that radiated from her toes, up through her calves, a severe physiological warning that her flesh was actively dying. Dark crimson smears marked the pristine snow behind her, a tragic, undeniable map of her suffering painted across the barren landscape. Her inner wolf whimpered, a pathetic, high-pitched sound of absolute despair, pacing frantically behind her ribs. The instinctual beast was already profoundly traumatized, bleeding spiritually from the brutal severing of the fated mate bond just days prior. Now, faced with the immediate physical threat of the hunting pack, the animal instincts screamed for her to lie down in the snow, to surrender, to expose her throat, and accept the inevitable bite of the alpha's hounds. Quiet, Everin commanded her wolf, her mental voice a fortress of sheer unbreakable stoicism. "We do not break, we do not crawl back, we survive." She lifted her chin, her storm-battered face transforming into a mask of absolute defiance. She would rather throw herself into the terrifying bottomless abyss of the gorge below, letting the jagged rocks claim her, than allow the southern huntsman to drag her back in chains. The subterranean oubliettes were black holes designed to swallow the inconvenient. She would not become a ghost rotting in the dark beneath Oakhaven, just so Clara Sterling could wear a stolen crown without guilt. She forced her right foot forward, the raw, torn skin of her heel dragging against a jagged patch of ice. A fresh wave of agony spiked through her nervous system, sharp and blinding, but she swallowed the scream before it could reach her lips. She took another step, then another. The ancient bridge stretched over the chasm, a narrow stone structure suspended violently between the oppressive heat of her past and the freezing, absolute unknown of her future. Across the bridge, barely visible through the swirling, blinding veil of the storm, Jarek Thorne watched her. The northern scout stood perfectly still, in the deep shadow of the massive stone archway that marked the true boundary of the northern wastes. Jarek was a man carved from the very mountains he protected, his heavy furs dusted with snow, his expression entirely guarded. His eyes, sharp and intensely analytical, tracked the slow, agonizing progress of the lone woman on the ice. He did not shout a warning. He did not raise a weapon or strike a defensive posture. His hand rested calmly on the worn leather pommel of his blade, his stillness reflecting the deep, instinctual patience of his kingdom. Jarek observed the dark blood staining the pristine frost. He saw the violent, uncontrollable trembling of her fragile frame, noting how the vicious crosswinds threatened to hurl her into the abyss with every gust. Yet, beneath the physical devastation, he also noted the impossible straightness of her spine. He recognized the pride anchored in her chin, the silent, unyielding dignity of a survivor who categorically refused to beg for mercy. The Southern Kingdom produced many things: arrogance, deceit, political theatrics, but it rarely produced such quiet, terrifying endurance. Jarek respected the ancient rules of sanctuary, knowing the border was a sacred line, but he also knew that the ultimate decision to open the gates did not belong to a mere scout. A massive guttural roar echoed from the southern cliffs behind her. Through the thick curtain of falling snow, the first of Garrett Finch's hounds broke onto the bridge's approach. The beast was a nightmare of dense muscle and iron-studded leather collars, its massive jaws slavering, its yellow eyes wide with the biological frenzy of the fresh scent. Behind it, two more massive hounds emerged from the whiteout, pulling violently at the heavy, clanking chain leashes held firmly by the lead huntsman. "There she is." Garrett's voice cut through the blizzard, harsh, abrasive, and carrying the distinct metallic tang of southern arrogance. "Hold the line. Do not let the little stray jump." Iverin's heart slammed against her sternum, the terrifying reality of her situation crashing down upon her shoulders. She was barely halfway across the bridge. Her legs were going completely numb, the muscles locking up and refusing to fire as the deep freeze penetrated her joints and thickened her blood. She could hear the heavy, thudding impacts of the hound's paws hitting the stone behind her, the clicking of their claws scraping the ice. They were closing the distance with terrifying, lethal speed. She tried to accelerate, to force her bleeding, ruined feet into a desperate run, but her body simply refused the command. The severe biological shock of the cold, combined with the lingering toxic trauma of Robert's public rejection, finally overwhelmed her central nervous system. The world tilted violently on its axis. Her right knee buckled. She hit the ice hard. The impact jarred her teeth, sending a shockwave of sickening pain straight up her spine. "Got you, you useless Omega," the huntsman sneered, his heavy boots crunching loudly on the frost as he unhooked the brass clips of the leashes, allowing the hounds to surge forward for the final, bloody takedown. Ivrin closed her eyes. She did not cry. She did not raise her arms to brace for the tearing of teeth. She simply let the icy wind wash over her face, her mind detaching from the immediate physical terror, retreating into a quiet, silent place of absolute, untouchable dignity. If this was the end, she would meet it with the silence that had always been her greatest weapon. But the teeth never came. Instead, the ambient temperature of the air around her suddenly violently shifted. The sterile, stinging smell of ice and ozone was instantly annihilated. A rich, deep, and intoxicatingly warm aroma flooded Ivrin's senses, wrapping around her shivering form like a physical barrier. It was the scent of crushed northern pines, wood smoke, and dark, ancient earth. It was an olfactory signature that carried a primal protective weight so profound, so absolute, that her whimpering inner wolf immediately fell, dead silent, paralyzed by an overwhelming instinctual awe. A massive, towering shadow fell over her fallen form, blocking out the biting wind. Ivrin forced her heavy eyelids open. Her vision was blurred, the edges tunneling into darkness from exhaustion, but through the swirling snow, she could see him. Nikolai Valerius had moved with a supernatural speed that completely defied his massive, imposing size. One moment, he had been standing silently by the northern archway. The next, he was directly in front of her, placing his broad body squarely between her broken form and the approaching hounds. He was a mountain of a man, radiating an aura of ancient, untamed power that made the very air crackle with heavy static electricity. He did not draw a sword. He did not strike a frantic combat stance or roar a challenge. He simply stood there, an immovable, terrifying monolith of northern sovereignty, his storm-grey eyes locked onto the southern hunters with a terrifying, absolute calm. The lead hound, mere feet away from sinking its teeth into Ivrin's cloak, suddenly slammed on its brakes. The massive beast hit the icy stone, its claws scraping frantically as it desperately tried to reverse its own momentum. It let out a high-pitched, pathetic whine, its tail tucking sharply between its hind legs. The other two hounds collided with it, instantly abandoning their manufactured bloodlust. They cowered, pressing their bellies flat to the frost, completely and utterly subjugated by the sheer, suffocating dominance, bleeding effortlessly from the silent king. The lead huntsman halted abruptly, his southern arrogance evaporating in the face of absolute apex predation. He stared up at the towering figure blocking the narrow bridge. His hand drifted instinctively toward the hunting blade at his belt, but he froze, his fingers trembling over the hilt. To draw steel here, on the northern threshold, against a monarch, was a guaranteed death sentence. Nikolai did not acknowledge the man's hesitation. He did not speak a single word to the hunters, who had driven this woman to the absolute edge of death. To him, they were nothing more than insignificant insects buzzing at the edge of his sovereign territory, entirely beneath. His direct address, slowly, deliberately, the King of Ashenir turned his broad back on the threat. He knelt on the freezing stone. Ivrin stared up at him, her breath hitching painfully in her ruined throat. The movement was so unexpected, so entirely devoid of the aggressive posturing alpha dominance she had known her entire life in Oakhaven. Robert Vance would never kneel. Robert Vance demanded that the entire world kneel to him, obsessed with his own fragile elevation. But here, on the deadly, blood-stained ice of the border, this terrifying, undeniably powerful sovereign lowered himself completely, bringing his piercing gaze level with hers. Ivrin didn't know the man watching her from the bridge was the Alpha King. She didn't know He had spent years listening to the shifting winds of the border, sensing the growing rot of the south, waiting patiently for the exact moment the ancestral magic would fracture. All she knew was the sudden, shocking gentleness in his expression. It was a look of profound, empathetic recognition, completely devoid of pity. With slow, deliberate movements, purposefully telegraphing his actions to ensure he did not startle her guarded instincts, Nikolai reached up and unclasped the heavy silver brooch at his broad shoulder. He pulled off his wolfskin cloak. The garment was massive, a masterpiece of survival crafted from thick obsidian fur that seemed to absorb the ambient, ghostly light of the storm. He leaned forward, closing the distance between them, and wrapped it carefully around Iverin's trembling shoulders, tucking the heavy edges beneath her chin to seal out the lethal wind. The physical impact of the warmth was instantaneous and overwhelmingly intense. The cloak was heavily infused with his signature scent, crushed needles, wood smoke, and the dry, safe heat of a deep mountain hearth. It hit her frozen, traumatized nervous system like a physical blow of pure, unadulterated relief. The biological torment of the ruptured mate bond, which had been burning a toxic hole in her chest for 5 relentless days, suddenly encountered a soothing, heavy blanket of absolute security. Her violent shivering intensified for a brief, agonizing second as her constricted blood vessels desperately tried to dilate, drinking in the ambient heat radiating from the thick obsidian fur. "You are safe," Nikolai said. His voice was a low, resonant rumble that vibrated deep within the marrow of her bones. It was not a desperate promise. It was not a commanding order. It was a statement of absolute, irrefutable fact, anchored by the weight of a kingdom. He reached down, his large, heavily calloused hands sliding gently beneath her knees and behind her back. He lifted her from the blood-stained ice, as if she weighed absolutely nothing. Iverin gasped, instinctually clutching the thick fur of the wolfskin cloak, pulling it tighter around her neck to anchor herself. Her cold cheek rested against the solid, unyielding wall of his chest. Beneath the thick layers of his dark tunic, she could hear the slow, powerful, and incredibly steady beat of his heart. It was a rhythm of absolute permanence, stark contrast to the frantic, panicked pacing of the man who had discarded her. Garrett finally found his voice, though it cracked pathetically with suppressed panic. "That woman belongs to King Robert Vance of Oakhaven. She is a traitor to the Southern Crown, a fugitive of the court. Hand her over, Northerner, or this will be taken as an act of war." Nikolai paused his movement. He held Iverin securely against his chest, shielding her completely from the biting wind, taking on the brunt of the blizzard with his own unprotected back. He slowly turned his head to look back over his shoulder at the southern huntsman. Those striking eyes had shifted. They were no longer calm and empathetic. They had hardened into the color of a suffocating winter avalanche, cold, merciless, and promising immediate, violent destruction. "She belongs to no one," Nikolai rumbled, his voice carrying easily over the shrieking gale, slicing through the wind like a physical blade. The sheer, unadulterated authority in his tone made the ancient stones of the bridge itself seem to vibrate in submission. "She has crossed into Ashenir. She is under my protection. If Robert Vance wishes to claim her, tell him to march his fragile armies to my gates. I will bury them in the snow." The southern hunter took a physical step back. The bloodhounds were actively dragging themselves backward on their bellies, their claws scraping the ice in a desperate bid to escape the crushing weight of the Northern King's unleashed aura. The man swallowed hard, his face draining of all color, realizing instantly that he had crossed into a realm where southern politics, forged documents, and royal decrees held absolutely no power. The wilderness only respected strength, and he was staring at the apex of it. Without another word, Garrett turned and yanked the heavy chains of his hounds, retreating rapidly down the southern slope, disappearing back into the blinding whiteout of the blizzard. Nikolai did not watch them go. His focus returned entirely to the fragile, shivering weight in his arms. He turned back toward the north and began to walk across the remainder of the stone bridge. Jarek Thorne stepped aside, bowing his head respectfully as his king passed, before falling silently into step behind them to guard their flank, his hand finally dropping away from the pommel of his blade. For Ivorin, the terrifying, deafening roar of the storm began to fade into a distant background hum. The excruciating pain in her shredded feet, the burning agony of the betrayal, the suffocating humiliation of the crowded throne room, all of it felt suddenly distant, muffled by the heavy obsidian fur and the rhythmic, steady heartbeat of the man carrying her. The rich aroma acted as a potent, natural sedative on her exhausted brain, systematically unraveling the tight, defensive coils of her survival instincts. Her inner wolf, which had spent 5 long days whimpering in the freezing dark, let out a long, quiet sigh. The instinctual beast curled up within her chest, finally closing its eyes in the presence of true safety. Ivorin's own eyelids grew impossibly heavy. She tried to keep them open, tried desperately to maintain her stoic vigilance, terrified that if she closed her eyes, she would wake up back on the cold floor of the Grand Day. But the absolute, unconditional warmth seeping into her frozen bones was too powerful to resist. She let her head fall fully against his chest, her scarred hands gripping his tunic. As they crossed beneath the massive stone archway, leaving the corrupt, burning lands of the south behind forever, Ivorin Eld surrendered to the dark, slipping into the first safe, dreamless sleep she had known in years. Consciousness returned to Ivorin Eld not as a sudden, violent jolt, but as a deliberate thawing of a deeply frozen lake. For the past 5 days, her awakening had been dictated by the brutal, unforgiving demands of survival. She had been shocked awake by the snapping of twigs, the howling of the winter gale, or the agonizing, biological spasms of the severed mate bond burning a corrosive hole in her chest. But now, as she drifted upward from the heavy depths of a dreamless sleep, the absolute first thing her sensory receptors registered was the profound, stunning absence of cold. She did not open her eyes immediately. The hypervigilance ingrained in her psyche by years of Southern court politics demanded that she assess her environment through stealth before revealing her consciousness. She lay perfectly still, focusing her exhausted mind on the tactile and olfactory information flooding her system. She was resting on something impossibly soft. The harsh, unforgiving stone of the mountain pass had been replaced by a thick, yielding mattress filled with dried heather and down. Heavy woven woolen blankets were draped over her small frame, pressing down upon her not with the suffocating, oppressive weight of Oakhaven's expectations, but with a grounded, absolute security. The fabric smelled faintly of wood smoke, cedar, and the crisp, clean ozone of the high country. The ambient temperature of the room was a steady, radiating warmth that seeped deep into her marrow, gently coaxing the tension from her violently contracted muscles. The biting, shrieking wind of the blizzard was completely gone, reduced to a muffled, distant vibration against thick, sturdy walls. In its place, the primary auditory focal point was the low, rhythmic crackle of a massive hearth fire consuming dry pine logs. Her inner wolf, the instinctual beast that had spent days pacing frantically in the dark, let out a soft, inquisitive huff. It did not whimper, it did not cower, it simply rested its heavy head on its paws, observing the quiet sanctuary with a cautious, silent reverence. Gradually, Ivorin allowed her heavy eyelids to flutter open. The ceiling above her was constructed of massive dark timber beams, blackened by years of hearth smoke and deeply scarred by the elements. The room was small, circular, and built entirely of thick, raw stone that trapped the heat perfectly. The dancing flames of the hearth cast a rich, molten gold light across the cabin, chasing away the deep shadows of the corners and creating an atmosphere of intense private safety. She shifted her weight, a sharp intake of breath hissing through her teeth as a dull, echoing ache radiated up her calves. The physiological toll of walking barefoot across the razor-sharp shale of the northern border was a brutal reality she could not ignore. Yet, as she pushed herself up on her elbows, she noticed her lower extremities. Her ruined, bleeding feet had been meticulously cleaned. The jagged lacerations and deep frostbite had been carefully wiped of all dirt and blood, wrapped gently in pristine white linen bandages. On the small wooden table beside the bed rested a heavy clay jar of hearth oil, its lid removed, filling the small space with the soothing, medicinal aroma of crushed northern pines and golden sap. The sheer level of gentle, methodical care applied to a woman who had been discarded as worthless just days ago was staggering. She also realized with a sudden, sharp spike of guarded anxiety that she was no longer wearing the shredded, frozen ruins of her simple southern dress. She was dressed in a massive, oversized linen tunic that fell well past her knees. The fabric was incredibly soft, incredibly warm, and smelled overwhelmingly of the same intoxicating, primal aroma that had enveloped her on the stone bridge. Her pulse accelerated, the ingrained instinct to flee flaring back to life. She gripped the heavy woolen blankets, pulling them up to her chin, her storm-battered eyes darting rapidly around the dimly lit room to locate the exit. The heavy silence of the cabin stretched unbroken, the quiet peace of 48 hours of uninterrupted healing hanging thick in the warm, cedar-scented air to gently ground her racing mind. "You have slept for 2 days," a low, resonant voice rumbled from the shadows. Ivarin froze, her spine snapping instantly straight. Nikolai Valerius sat in a heavy, high-backed wooden chair positioned at the far edge of the hearth's golden light. The northern monarch was a monolith of dark, quiet power. He had discarded the massive wolfskin cloak he had used to shield her at the border, wearing only a simple, dark tunic of woven wool and heavy leather trousers. The casual attire did absolutely nothing to diminish his terrifying, imposing scale. His broad shoulders seemed to absorb the ambient light, his physical presence dominating the spatial geometry of the small cabin. Yet, his posture was a masterclass in deliberate, aggressive self-restraint. He did not stand when she woke. He did not step forward to tower over her bed. He remained seated, his massive, heavily calloused hands resting loosely on his knees, entirely open, displaying no weapons. His striking, tempestuous gaze was fixed intentionally on the dancing flames of the hearth, pointedly avoiding direct, predatory eye contact that might trigger her traumatized defensive instincts. He was actively, painstakingly minimizing his own dominance to give her room to breathe. Robert Vance had always demanded that she look at him, requiring her constant validation of his fragile authority. This powerful, apex predator simply offered her space. "Where am I?" Ivarin asked. Her voice was terribly raspy, a fragile, cracked whisper that barely carried over the popping of the fire, the vocal cords damaged by days of inhaling freezing, sub-zero air. "You are in a border watch cabin, safe within the northern territory of Ashenir," Nikolai replied, his tone remaining low, even, and meticulously steady. "The storm is still raging outside, masking the passers. No southern forces can cross the bridge. You are entirely secure." He did not ask her why she was running. He did not demand an explanation for the blood on the snow or the hounds on her trail. He accepted her presence with an unconditional, stoic grace that left her momentarily completely unmoored. The Northern King leaned forward with deliberate, unhurried grace. He reached toward a small cast-iron hook positioned directly over the hearth flames, lifting a dark, heavy iron kettle. He poured a steaming, fragrant liquid into a carved wooden bowl. The rich, savory aroma of roasted root vegetables, salted venison, and wild mountain herbs instantly flooded the cabin, hitting Ivarin's starved olfactory senses with devastating force. Her stomach contracted violently, a sharp, biological reminder that she had eaten nothing but frozen crusts and snow for nearly a week. The sovereign stood up. Ivarin's grip on the blankets tightened, her knuckles turning bone-white as her entire body tensed for an intrusion into her personal space. Nikolai saw the micro-reaction. He stopped instantly. He did not approach the mattress. Instead, he walked to a sturdy wooden table, positioned exactly halfway between the hearth and her bed. He set the steaming wooden bowl down on the polished surface, placed a carved wooden spoon beside it, and then immediately took 3 large steps backward, returning to his chair. "Eat," he commanded softly, not an order of dominance but a biological imperative. Your body has consumed its own reserves to survive the cold. The broth will help stabilize your core temperature." Everin stared at him, her defensive walls warring with the overwhelming, instinctual pull of the food. She studied his face in the flickering golden light. His features were stark, angular, and deeply hardened by a life spent ruling a merciless frozen wasteland. There was a dangerous edge to his jawline, a lethal capability etched into the very structure of his bones. But his expression was remarkably clear of the smug, manipulative arrogance she had endured for years in Oakhaven. There was no pity in his gaze, only a quiet, profound respect for a survivor. With agonizing caution, the young woman pushed the heavy blankets aside. She swung her bandaged feet over the edge of the mattress, the thick woven rugs covering the stone floor, offering a warm, soft landing. Her legs trembled violently as they bore her weight for the first time in 2 days, the muscles screaming in protest, but she forced her spine to remain perfectly straight. She would not crawl. She would not show weakness. She walked the short distance to the table, her movements stiff and guarded. She picked up the wooden bowl. The dark wood was beautifully warm against her raw, scarred palms. She brought the rim to her lips and took a small, hesitant sip. The hot broth hit her system like a shockwave of pure liquid vitality, a fierce contrast to the 48 hours of feverish oblivion she had just endured. The rich, salty fluid coated her ruined throat, cascading down into her hollow stomach and radiating an intense, deeply satisfying heat outward through her shivering veins. It was the most incredible thing she had ever tasted. The simple combination of roasted root vegetables and wild mountain herbs felt like an elixir designed specifically to pull her soul back from the edge of the abyss. Her inner wolf let out a soft, contented rumble, the severe biological trauma of the past week beginning to momentarily recede under the heavy weight of genuine, unquestioning nourishment. She drank more deeply, her stoic facade slipping just a fraction as she closed her eyes, savoring the absolute physical relief of being warm, full, and completely safe. "I did not mean to trespass on your territory, King Nikolai," Everin said quietly, lowering the half-empty bowl. She kept her gaze fixed on the steam rising from the surface, uncomfortable with the vulnerability of the moment. "I only intended to escape the south. I will leave your lands as soon as my feet are capable of making the journey." Nikolai's jaw tightened. A muscle jumped in his cheek, a fleeting flash of intense, primal possessiveness that he instantly clamped down upon and buried beneath his iron control. He gripped the armrests of his wooden chair, his knuckles paling, as he forced his instincts to remain completely subdued. "The northern wastes are unforgiving to those who travel without a pack," he said, his voice dropping an octave deeper, vibrating with a heavy, unspoken truth. "You are not a prisoner here, Ivarin Eld. You may leave whenever you wish, but you do not have to. The gates of Ashenir remain open to those who survive the cold." He knew her full name. He knew exactly who she was. The revelation should have sparked a new wave of terror in her chest, a fear that he would use her as a political pawn or a hostage to leverage against Robert. But as she looked up, meeting those striking tempest-hued irises for the first time, she saw no calculation. She saw only a vast, deep patience. Nikolai stood up, moving with that same deliberate, unhurried grace. He walked to a heavy cedar chest situated near the cabin's reinforced iron-banded door. He lifted a neatly folded stack of garments, thick wool leggings, a heavy woven tunic, and a pair of soft, fur-lined leather boots designed to accommodate heavy bandages. He placed the clothing on the edge of the table. "I will check the perimeter of the pass," Nikolai stated, turning toward the heavy timber door. "The hearth is fully stocked. Rest." Without waiting for her to offer her a response, the massive sovereign pulled open the iron-banded door and stepped out into the howling, lethal blizzard, pulling the heavy wood shut behind him with a solid, echoing thud. He had deliberately exiled himself into the sub-zero storm simply to provide her with the absolute privacy to dress and eat in peace. Ivarin stood alone in the golden, firelit warmth of the cabin, the wooden bowl clutched tightly in her hands. She stared at the closed door, the sheer, staggering reality of his restraint washing over her. For her entire life, she had been taught that sovereign power was loud, demanding, and inherently cruel. She had believed that all kings were fragile, paranoid creatures who needed to crush those beneath them to feel tall. She had never known that true power could be this quiet. Her inner wolf curled up in the warm space behind her ribs, the frantic, panicked pacing, finally, permanently ceasing. The beast closed its eyes, anchoring itself to the residual scent of crushed pines and wood smoke that clung to the soft linen tunic she wore. We are small things in a world of teeth, Ivorin thought, reflecting on the brutality of the border. But, for the first time in her life, the deadliest set of teeth in the kingdom was standing guard outside her door, actively choosing to protect her instead of consuming her. Outside the thick timber door, the lethal northern blizzard continued to batter the watch cabin, shrieking through the jagged mountain passes. But the freezing wind did not stop at the borderline. Sweeping over the ancient masonry of the stone bridge of Ashenir, the violent gale plunged southward, carrying the merciless death of the northern wastes directly into the valley of Oakhaven. It howled through the once prosperous southern kingdom, slicing through failing magical wards and sinking its icy teeth deep into the foundations of the royal keep. Inside the grand hall of Oakhaven, the suffocating, unnatural nightmare was already taking hold. It had been precisely 7 days since the disastrous rejection ceremony upon the grand days. 7 days since Ivorin had dropped the shattered ring onto the polished stone floor, the exact moment the grand hearth fires had first inexplicably dimmed and the stones had begun to lose their warmth, and vanished into the dark, taking the silent, stabilizing gravity of the pack with her. Robert Vance sat upon his elevated throne, the heavy gold crown resting upon his brown hair, but he did not look like a victorious monarch who had successfully secured a powerful, dominant alliance. He looked like a man actively being consumed from the inside out. The oppressive, roaring heat that usually characterized the great hall of Oakhaven, a magical manifestation of the land's prosperity and agricultural strength, had completely vanished. In its place, a strange, rancid dampness had infiltrated the castle. The air felt heavy, stale, and sickeningly cold, carrying the faint, unmistakable odor of rotting vegetation and molding tapestries. Robert gripped the gilded armrests of his throne, his knuckles white. He was sweating profusely, beads of cold perspiration tracking down his pale temples and soaking the collar of his crimson velvet tunic, yet he could not stop violently shivering. His inner beast was tearing itself apart, pacing frantically and thrashing blindly against the walls of his consciousness in an agonizing, perpetual state of corrosive grief. The physical toll of actively severing a fated mate bond was supposed to fade after a few days, especially once a new Luna was marked and the pack hierarchy stabilized. But the pain was not fading. It was intensifying, a phantom blade of jagged ice twisting mercilessly in his chest with every shallow breath he took, making it impossible to eat, impossible to sleep, impossible to think. He had assumed his misery was a purely internal weakness, a temporary biological adjustment. But the reality of his monumental mistake was now physically manifesting across the entirety of his domain. Clara Sterling stood near the massive, arched windows that overlooked the southern valley, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. The shimmering silver silk that had looked like liquid moonlight just a week ago now appeared dull, clinging poorly to her frame in the dim, grey light filtering through the glass. Her breath actually plumed in the air, a visible white mist of condensation that should have been impossible within the royal sanctum. "The eastern crops are blackening in the fields, Robert," Clara snapped, her voice stripped entirely of the sweet, calculated honey she had utilized during their courtship. She paced aggressively in front of the windows, the sharp clicks of her silver heels echoing off the cold walls. Her tone was abrasive, grating against his already frayed nerves like coarse iron. "The river has completely frozen over near the lower mills, and the border wards are failing. The Council of Elders is demanding an explanation, and half the servant staff has refused to light the hearths because the wood itself has turned to petrified ice. Robert squeezed his eyes shut, a sharp tremor racking his frame. "I am aware of the situation, Clara. You are the King of Oakhaven," she hissed, turning on her heel to glare at him, her dark eyes flashing with greedy indignation. "Your aura is supposed to maintain the warmth of this valley. I am a dominant wolf. Together, our combined presence should be pushing the frost back to the northern mountains. Why is the stone cracking beneath our feet?" The monarch did not have the strength to answer her. He opened his eyes with a sluggish, trembling effort, staring down at the polished stone floor where his former mate had stood exactly 1 week ago. A terrifying, jagged fracture had appeared in the ancient stonework, spider webbing outward from the exact spot where the shattered ring had fallen. From the cracks, a thick, unnatural frost was slowly creeping upward, crystallizing the edges of the grand red carpets and turning the vibrant crimson threads to a dead, brittle grey. The magical barrier that protected Oakhaven from the lethal northern climate was not just failing. It was actively collapsing. For generations, the rulers of Oakhaven had believed their prosperity was maintained by the sheer dominance and aggressive strength of the Alpha King. Robert had internalized this arrogant lie, completely convinced that he was the sole anchor of the territory's magic. He had discarded his true mate because he believed she was a useless, wolfless omega, a weak link that would compromise the kingdom's defense. The realization that hit him in the cold, damp silence of the throne room was so devastating it nearly stopped his heart. Iverin had never been weak. Her absolute silence, her stoic endurance, her quiet, uncomplaining labor. It had not been the submission of a low-status servant. It had been the manifestation of a sleeping, ancient bloodline. She was the true anchor. Her dormant light magic, inherently tied to the sacred geography of the land, was the only thing that had been holding the southern heat and prosperity together. Without her quiet presence, grounding the chaotic, aggressive energy of the pack, the entire ecosystem of Oakhaven was tearing itself apart. He hadn't just rejected his fated mate. He had actively exiled the very heartbeat of his kingdom. The heavy oak doors of the grand hall suddenly slammed open. The iron hinges shrieked, shattering the tense silence. Garrett Finch stumbled into the room. The lead huntsman was virtually unrecognizable. The man who had proudly led a pack of terrifying bloodhounds out of the castle, days ago now looked like a broken, hollowed-out corpse. His heavy leather hunting gear was torn to shreds and heavily coated in thick white rime that flaked onto the carpets as he moved. His face was a ghastly shade of blue, the skin around his eyes blackened and peeling from severe frostbite. He was completely alone. He carried no leashes, and the echoing, predatory baying of his prized hounds was entirely absent. The sheer absence of the dogs was a louder statement than any scream. Garrett collapsed onto his knees at the base of the dais, his breath rattling violently in his chest, his hands trembling so badly he could barely support his own weight. "Where is she?" Robert demanded, his voice cracking, a sudden, desperate surge of panic overriding his physical pain. He shot up from the throne, descending the first 2 steps. "Where is the Omega?" The huntsman lifted his head, his eyes wide and vacant, completely traumatized by whatever he had witnessed in the high country. "We tracked her blood to the edge of the gorge, my king," Garrett rasped, his teeth chattering uncontrollably. "She crossed the boundary. She crossed the stone bridge." Clara scoffed loudly from the window. "Then she is dead. The blizzard will have frozen her solid within an hour." "Good riddance." Garrett shook his head frantically, holding up a trembling, frost-bitten hand. No, she is not dead. He was waiting for her." The ambient temperature in the throne room seemed to plummet another 10 degrees. Robert froze mid-step, his blood turning to ice. "Who?" he whispered, the name already forming a suffocating knot of pure terror in his throat. "Who was waiting?" "The monster of the north," Garrett breathed out, dropping his gaze to the cracked stone floor, unable to look his monarch in the eye. "King Nikolai Valerius." Robert stumbled backward, his heel catching on the edge of the stone step. He fell hard onto the steps of the dais, his crown slipping slightly awry, entirely stripped of his royal dignity. Nikolai Valerius, the deadliest rival Oakhaven had ever known, a sovereign whose power was so absolute, so terrifyingly vast, that he ruled the northern wastes without ever raising his voice. Robert had spent his entire reign actively avoiding the northern border, terrified of the silent king who possessed the strength to crush the southern armies with a single command. "He didn't kill her," Garrett continued, his voice a hollow, broken echo. "He shielded her. He used his own aura to break my hounds. He carried her across the bridge into Ashenir. He claimed her under his protection." Clara Sterling's face twisted into a mask of pure, ugly rage. She marched toward the dais, her silver heels clicking sharply against the freezing stone. "This is a political disaster, Robert. The Northern King now holds a Southern citizen as a hostage. He will use her to extort our borders. You must send the army immediately and demand her return." Robert stared at his new Luna, entirely horrified by her utter lack of comprehension. The ambitious noblewoman was blind to the true, terrifying reality of the situation. Nikolai Valerius did not take hostages. He did not play southern political games. If the Northern King had wrapped the runaway bride in his own wolfskin cloak, if he had personally carried her across the border, it meant something far more permanent and far more devastating. The ancient, dormant magic of the true Luna had crossed the border. Ivorin's power, the very anchor that sustained Oakhaven's warmth, was now resting in the hands of the most powerful apex predator on the continent. The frost creeping up the walls of the throne room was not just a symptom of her absence. It was the biological transfer of the land's loyalty. The earth itself was following her north. "We cannot send the army," Robert whispered, his voice trembling uncontrollably, his gaze fixed on the spreading web of ice radiating from the shattered ring's impact point. "He will slaughter them. Nikolai Valerius has buried entire legions in the snow for crossing his threshold." "Then we will freeze to death," Clara shrieked, finally dropping the aristocratic facade, her voice echoing shrilly off the high, moulding ceiling. "Look around you, you weak fool. The barrier is gone. If you do not drag that useless maid back here to anchor the wards, we will lose the kingdom by the end of the month." Robert pulled his knees to his chest, the physical agony of the severed bond, combining with the absolute terror of his political ruin. He had discarded the quiet outcast to secure his power, to elevate himself above the whispers of the noble houses. He had wanted a queen who looked like a weapon. Instead, he had thrown away the very shield that kept them all alive. He realized with a sickening, sinking certainty that he had no choice. He could not survive the winter without her magic, and he could not survive the agony of the broken bond without her physical presence. He would have to march his fragile armies to the gates of Ashenir. He would have to face the monster of the north. "Prepare the high guard," Robert choked out, his eyes wide and vacant as he stared at the dying embers of the hearth. "We march for the stone bridge at dawn. It would be a death march, a desperate, agonizing crawl across a freezing valley that would ultimately stretch for weeks, but he had no other choice. For 14 days, the storm outside the watch cabin showed absolutely no signs of breaking. 2 full weeks had passed since Nikolai Valerius had carried her unconscious body across the stone bridge of Ashenir, shielding her from the relentless pursuit of Garrett Finch's hounds. In that time, the blizzard had raged without a single hour of pause. Through the narrow, iron-barred window cut deep into the thick stone wall, Eva and Eld watched the snow rage. The wind shrieked through the jagged mountain passes with a mindless, lethal fury, hurling dense sheets of white ice against the glass. It was a chaotic, freezing violence that sought to consume everything in its path. Yet, inside the small circular room, the atmosphere remained anchored in a profound, unyielding stillness. The massive hearth fire popped, a loud crack of dry pine that sent a shower of bright orange sparks drifting up the blackened chimney. The ambient heat in the cabin was heavy and thorough, seeping deeply into the thick woven rugs and the solid masonry. It was a dry, restorative warmth that stood in stark contrast to the suffocating, swamp-like humidity she had endured for years in Oakhaven. Sitting on the edge of the soft mattress, the young woman stared down at her hands. The raw red scratches on her palms were completely scabbed over, but the deep, throbbing ache in her lower extremities was impossible to ignore. Her ruined feet were tightly bound in pristine white linen, propped up on a small wooden stool. The severe frostbite and jagged lacerations from the razor-sharp shale of her desperate border crossing had left her practically immobilized for the past fortnight. Her inner wolf paced a slow, restless circle behind her ribs. The instinctual beast was no longer cowering in absolute terror as it had on the night of the rejection, but it remained highly guarded, its ears pinned back as it listened to the howling gale outside. It was waiting for the inevitable catch. In the southern courts, no comfort was ever provided without a steep, agonizing price. The heavy timber door creaked, the iron hinges protesting against the cold as it was pushed open. A sudden blast of freezing, ozone-scented air swept into the room, causing the hearth flames to dance violently. Nikolai stepped across the threshold, immediately pulling the thick wood shut behind him with a solid thud that sealed the storm back outside. He brought the scent of the high country with him, a sharp, clean aroma of crushed needles, falling snow, and the distinct primal musk of an apex predator. He had removed his heavy furs, wearing only a dark, woven tunic that clung tightly to the broad, terrifying expanse of his shoulders. His thick dark hair was dusted with melting snowflakes, catching the golden light of the fire as he turned toward her. Everin's spine snapped straight, her hands instinctively curled into tight fists upon her lap, her muscles locking defensively. The Northern Sovereign stopped his advance immediately. He did not take another step toward her bed. Instead, he moved with that same deliberate, painstaking restraint she had witnessed every day since her rescue, crossing to the small wooden table. He set down a fresh stack of clean bandages and a small iron basin filled with steaming water. Beside it, he placed the heavy clay jar of hearth oil. "The border remains sealed," Nikolai said. His voice was a low, resonant rumble that effortlessly penetrated the background noise of the storm, vibrating in the marrow of her bones. "The southern hounds have not returned to the bridge. You are secure." He did not demand her gratitude. He simply offered the tactical reality of her safety as an undeniable fact. Slowly, he turned his storm-grey eyes toward her bandaged feet. "The cold has receded from your blood, but the torn flesh requires tending. The bandages must be changed, or the wounds will fester in the heat." Everin swallowed hard, her throat feeling suddenly terribly dry. In her previous life, physical vulnerability was a weapon constantly used against her. Robert had mocked her lack of a dominant wolf, using her perceived frailty to justify his public betrayal. To allow this massive, dangerous monarch to touch her most severe injuries required a leap of faith her traumatized mind was struggling to process. "I can do it," she whispered, her voice raspy and fragile. Nikolai held her gaze. He saw the sharp, panicked flutter of her pulse at the base of her throat. He recognized the deep, systemic fear of a woman who had been systematically conditioned to expect pain from those in power. "You cannot reach the lacerations on your heels without tearing the scabs," the king replied evenly. He did not move closer. He simply stood by the table, his heavily calloused hands resting flat against the polished wood. "I will not touch you without your permission, Everin. You possess absolute sovereignty over your own space here." The sheer respect in his statement was staggering. It completely dismantled the defensive architecture she had spent years building. She studied the harsh, angular lines of his jaw, the lethal capability etched into his massive frame, and found absolutely no trace of the manipulative arrogance that defined the southern nobility. With a slow, trembling breath, she gave a single slight nod. The sovereign approached the mattress. He did not loom over her. He immediately went down on one knee upon the woven rug, positioning his broad shoulders below her eye level. The deliberate lowering of his physical status was a stunning display of sovereign submission, an explicit refusal to use his towering height to intimidate her. His hands were enormous, the knuckles scarred from decades of brutal mountain warfare, yet his movements were impossibly gentle. He reached for the knot of the linen bindings on her right foot. His fingertips brushed against her ankle. A sudden, sharp jolt of static electricity snapped through the air between them. Everin gasped, her inner beast suddenly standing at absolute attention, its ears pricking forward. The contact was not a violation. It was a profound biological shock of pure grounding energy, the residual, corrosive suffering of the broken connection, the toxic ache that had been gnawing at her chest for a week, recoiled violently in the presence of his touch. Nikolai's jaw tightened. A muscle jumped in his cheek, his piercing gaze darkening to the color of bruised iron as he felt the heavy, undeniable pull of fated recognition. But he ruthlessly clamped down on his own predatory instincts, his face remaining a mask of stoic concentration. He meticulously unwrapped the blood-stained linen. The sight of her ruined soles was gruesome. The delicate skin was torn to ribbons, the edges of the lacerations angry and swollen, the deeper tissues blackened by severe frostbite. It was a physical testament to her, sheer terrifying endurance. The king reached for the clay jar. He scooped a thick measure of the golden hearth oil onto his fingers. The rich, medicinal aroma of pine sap and crushed herbs immediately filled the small cabin, masking the metallic tang of dried blood. The southern monarchs build their power by draining those around them, Nikolai murmured, his voice dropping to a deeply intimate register as he began to massage the warm salve into the unbroken skin around her wounds. They believe magic is a finite resource, something to be hoarded and extracted from their subjects. They look for dominant wolves because they are terrified of their own weakness. Everin watched his hands, mesmerized by the stark contrast between his lethal strength and the exquisite care he was applying to her broken flesh. "Robert said I was empty," she confessed, the words slipping out before her guarded mind could stop them. "He told the entire court I was a wolfless omega, a dead weight on the kingdom." The monarch's thumbs paused their circular motion. He looked up, his eyes locking onto hers with an intensity that made the breath catch in her lungs. "Robert Vance is a blind, parasitic fool," the Northern King rumbled, the quiet lethality in his tone, making the hairs on her arms stand up. He looked at an ocean, and called it a puddle because he lacked the lungs to dive deep. He shifted his grip, his large palms supporting the arches of her feet. "You are not empty, Everin. Your bloodline is older than the stones of Oakhaven. Your magic does not manifest as a feral beast designed to tear throats. It manifests as the anchor, the light that sustains the earth itself. It is not dead. It is merely sleeping, buried beneath years of southern frost. I don't know how to reach it," she whispered, a sudden, desperate ache rising in her chest. "Close your eyes," he commanded softly. She obeyed, the heavy weight of his unconditional presence, allowing her to lower her final shield. "Do not search for a weapon," Nikolai guided, his thumbs resuming their slow, rhythmic pressure against her skin, working the warm oil deep into her frozen joints. "Do not search for teeth or claws. Focus on the heat of the fire. Sense the solid stone beneath the floorboards. Listen to the steady beat of your own heart." Everin drew a long, slow breath. She focused entirely on the tactile sensations grounding her in the present moment. The crackle of the dry pine, the heavy, protective scent of his aura, the firm, unyielding support of his hands holding her broken pieces together. Deep within the darkest, most secluded corner of her consciousness, something stirred. It was not the frantic pacing of her traumatized wolf. It was something profoundly different. A quiet, resonant vibration, a spark of pure, unadulterated warmth that had nothing to do with the external heat of the cabin. "Breathe it forward," the sovereign whispered. The spark ignited. A sudden, intense wave of golden heat erupted within her sternum. It did not burn like the toxic rejection of the mate bond. It flowed like molten sunlight, rich, heavy, and infinitely soothing. The dormant light magic, suppressed by a lifetime of emotional starvation and systemic abuse, finally found a safe harbor. It surged through her bloodstream, a rushing river of restorative energy that chased the lingering cold from her marrow. The sensation physically manifested. Ivorin gasped, her eyes flying open. A soft, ethereal golden luminescence began to radiate from her own skin. It travelled down her legs, following the path of the magic, pooling directly into the severe lacerations on her feet where Nikolai's hands rested. The pain vanished. It was not a gradual fading. It was an absolute, instantaneous eradication of suffering. Beneath the king's calloused fingers, the torn flesh began to knit together. The blackened, frost-bitten tissue sloughed away, dissolving into harmless ash as fresh, healthy pink skin bloomed in place. The deep, jagged cuts left by the mountain shale sealed themselves flawlessly, leaving behind only faint, silvery scars as proof of her survival. But the ancient magic did not stop there. It was too vast, too long suppressed to simply heal her wounds and fade. The golden light spilled over the edges of her toes, dripping down like liquid sunshine onto the woven rug and sinking directly into the raw stone floor of the watch cabin. The ambient temperature in the room spiked, suffused with the scent of a deep spring thaw. The thick layer of persistent frost that coated the bottom edges of the heavy timber door instantly sublimated into steam. Then the stone itself yielded. Through the microscopic cracks in the masonry near the hearth, tiny, vibrant shoots of green mountain grass pushed their way upward. They uncurled rapidly, defying the sub-zero blizzard raging just inches away on the other side of the wall. Amidst the sudden patch of impossible greenery, a single, delicate white moonflower bloomed, its petals unfurling to reveal a glowing, golden center. Evelyn stared at the grass, her breath leaving her in a stunned, trembling exhale. The sheer magnitude of what she had just done, of what she had always been capable of, crashed down upon her. She was not a useless Omega. She was a living conduit of the Earth's vitality. Nikolai slowly released her fully healed feet. He did not pull away in shock. He looked at the blooming moonflower, his harsh features softening into an expression of profound, quiet reverence. "You see," the king murmured, his voice thick with an emotion he fiercely controlled. "You are the dawn, Ivorin, and no man can lock the dawn in a dungeon." The blooming of the moonflower on that 14th night was only the beginning of her rebirth. Over the next 2 weeks, the watch cabin transformed from a mere sick room into a sanctuary of profound awakening. As the first month of her exile from Oakhaven drew to a close, Evelyn Eld began to truly understand the sheer depth of the ancient bloodline Robert Vance had so callously discarded. He had chosen the ambitious Duchess Clara Sterling to stand beside him, prioritizing political vanity over a fated bond. In doing so, he had unknowingly severed the very root that kept his kingdom alive. Every evening, as the brutal northern winds battered the iron-barred windows and the temperature plummeted into lethal extremes, Nikolai Valerius sat with her before the heavy stone hearth. He did not push her. He did not demand exhausting demonstrations of her newfound power, nor did he look at her as a weapon to be wielded. He simply provided the heavy, grounding presence she needed to safely explore the golden warmth now humming steadily in her veins. Under his patient, silent guidance, she learned to coax the light from her fingertips. She learned to hold it without fear, to let it weave through the cold masonry, bringing forth small patches of vibrant green moss from the cracks in the stone, the toxic, corrosive anguish of the destroyed mate bond. The jagged ache that had gnawed at her chest for the first 2 weeks faded into a distant, hollow echo. It was entirely overwhelmed and replaced by the restorative, unyielding safety of Nikolai's absolute protection. Wrapped in his massive wolfskin cloak, inhaling the deep, soothing scent of crushed pine and wood smoke, she found the quiet domestic security she had been denied her entire life. They spoke in low murmurs as the fire crackled, trading the silence of survivors. He told her of the frozen northern wastes, of a kingdom built on endurance rather than extraction. She told him of the glass-like fragility of the southern court, where every smile hid a dagger. Meanwhile, a very different reality was unfolding in the southern valley. Evelyn did not know it, But as her dormant light magic fully awakened in Ashenir, the stolen vitality that had sustained Oakhaven began to violently unravel. Without her passive, unacknowledged presence to anchor the territory, the fragile ecosystem of Robert's domain was freezing solid. The autumn crops withered beneath sudden, unnatural frosts. The magical barriers protecting the southern keep fractured into jagged shards of useless energy. The Southern King's desperate army had spent the last month slowly starving, their physical strength deteriorating day by day, as the winter they thought they could manipulate turned its teeth against them. The peaceful sanctuary in the watch cabin lasted exactly 30 days. On the dawn of her first full month in Ashenir, the storm outside continued its mindless shrieking, the blizzard showing absolutely no signs of breaking. Iverin was standing by the hearth, the golden light of her magic flowing seamlessly between her fingers, when a sudden, sharp impact shattered the intimate quiet of the room. A heavy fist pounded rapidly against the thick timber door. The spell was instantly broken. Iverin flinched violently, her inner wolf snapping its jaws as the ingrained terror of discovery flooded back into her system. The golden luminescence fading from her skin receded, retreating back into her core to protect itself from the impending threat. Nikolai stood up. The transition was terrifyingly seamless. The gentle, patient healer vanished, instantly replaced by the undisputed apex predator of the northern wastes. His spine straightened to its full, imposing height, his broad shoulders blocking her completely from the entryway. "Enter," he commanded, his tone completely stripped of warmth, reverting to the cold, echoing authority of a sovereign. The iron hinges shrieked. Jarek Thorne stepped quickly across the threshold, pushing the heavy wood shut against the howling gale. The northern scout was covered in a thick layer of rime ice. His heavy furs were frozen stiff, his breath plumbing in rapid, harsh clouds in the ambient heat of the cabin. His sharp, analytical eyes darted briefly to the impossible patch of green grass still thriving on the stone floor, a flicker of profound shock crossing his stoic features, before his immense discipline immediately snapped his focus back to his monarch. "My king," Jarek said, offering a curt, rigid bow. The tension radiating from the scout's posture was a tangible force, carrying the distinct, metallic tang of impending violence. "Report," Nikolai demanded, his steely gaze locked onto his trusted border captain. "I have just returned from the southern overlook," Jarek stated, his voice tight, the words clipping the air with military precision. "The blizzard has stripped the visibility down to a few yards, but the ground vibrations are undeniable. The southern forces have mobilized. They are marching through the lower pass." Iverin's heart slammed against her ribs. The phantom weight of the shattered ring seemed to suddenly constrict around her bare finger, a psychological ghost of her past, attempting to drag her back into submission. Robert. He hadn't given up. He hadn't accepted his loss. "Numbers?" the Northern King asked, his expression remaining completely impassive. "The entirety of the Oakhaven High Guard," the scout replied grimly. 300 heavy infantry, moving slowly through the snowdrifts. They are carrying the crimson banners of Robert Vance. They are desperate, sire. Their armor is freezing to their skin, and their supply lines are non-existent. They have spent the entire last month rotting from the inside out as Oakhaven's defenses collapsed. They are marching as if the earth itself is falling away behind them. It was collapsing, Iverin realized with a sudden, sickening clarity. Robert Vance was not marching into the lethal northern winter out of a sudden, miraculous surge of fated devotion. He didn't love her. He had never loved her. He was marching his men to their deaths, because without her light magic to anchor the territory, the fragile ecosystem of the Southern Valley was freezing solid. He was coming to drag his property back, to lock her away in the dark, and force her aura to sustain his corrupt, hollow throne. They will reach the southern approach of the stone bridge within the hour. Jarek finished, his hand resting instinctively on the worn leather pommel of his blade. They have brought heavy chains. The mention of the chains caused a physical reaction in Iverin, A low, pathetic whimper escaped her lips before she could bite it back. She pulled her arms tightly across her chest, her fully healed feet planting themselves firmly on the warm stone. Those sunless pits were built to bury people alive. If Robert managed to put those chains on her, she would never see the sky again. Nikolai turned his head slightly, catching the sound of her distress. He did not walk over to comfort her. He did not offer hollow, poetic promises that everything would be fine. He simply stood like a fortress of dark iron, absorbing the terror bleeding into the room and annihilating it with his own absolute gravity. "Jarek," the Sovereign rumbled, his voice dropping to a deadly, lethal frequency that made the flames in the hearth shudder. "Rouse the border garrison. Sound the deep horn." The scout's eyes widened a fraction. To sound the deep horn was to declare a state of absolute war. It was the signal that the northern patience had officially ended and the slaughter was authorized. "Sire, they outnumber the current garrison 10-1. Should we fall back to the inner keep and trap them in the gorge?" "No," Nikolai stated, his tone devoid of any negotiation. "We do not cede a single inch of ice. If Robert Vance wishes to claim what is mine, he will have to pry it from my dead hands on the threshold of my kingdom." He turned fully toward her. Evelyn looked up at him, her storm-battered eyes wide with a mixture of awe and terror. He was going to fight an entire army for her, a woman he had sheltered for exactly 30 days, a runaway who had brought nothing but trouble and the threat of war to his quiet sanctuary. "You don't have to do this," she managed to say, her voice trembling violently. "If you fight them, your men will bleed. The Southern Guard is heavily armored. I can leave through the Northern Pass. I can disappear. He won't find me." The Sovereign of the North walked slowly back to the table. He picked up his heavy leather sword belt, the thick iron buckles clinking sharply in the quiet room. He strapped the massive ancient blade around his waist, the weapon looking like an extension of his own lethal will. "We are small things in a world of teeth, Ivarin Eld," Nikolai said quietly, quoting an old northern proverb as he adjusted the hilt of his sword. "But we do not run from the dark. We stand and we break its jaw." He stepped closer to her, looking down with a gaze so fiercely protective it nearly brought tears to her eyes. "You will never wear chains again. You will never be forced to kneel to a weak man who does not know your value. I open my gates to you, and I do not close them." The sheer, unapologetic certainty in his words severed the final chords of her lingering southern fear. The realization hit her with the force of an avalanche. She was no longer a victim fleeing through the snow. She was a woman who could bloom grass from dead stone. She carried the ancient power of the earth in her veins, and the most feared monarch on the continent had just pledged his life to shield her. Nikolai reached out, his calloused hand gently brushing a stray lock of dark hair away from her face. It was a fleeting, impossibly tender gesture that completely contradicted the violence he was about to unleash. "Stay here, where it is warm," the king instructed softly. "I will return when the snow is quiet." "No," the single word hung in the air, sharp and clear. Ivarin lifted her chin, her storm-grey eyes locking onto his with that same unbreakable, silent dignity that had allowed her to drop the betrothal ring without a single tear. The physical pain of her past was entirely gone, replaced by a thrumming, electric current of golden energy that demanded to be used. She was done hiding. She was done being a secret. "He is coming for me," the young woman said, her voice dropping its fragile rasp, resonating with the ancient awakened authority of her bloodline. "He thinks I am a weak, wolfless Omega who will cower behind your walls. I will not give him the satisfaction of my absence." Nikolai paused, his hand dropping from her face. He studied the fierce, unyielding determination burning in her eyes, recognizing the true birth of a queen. A slow, dangerous smile curved the corner of the Northern King's mouth, a look of absolute, terrifying pride. "Then we stand together," the Sovereign agreed. "Let us show the King of Oakhaven exactly what he threw away." They left the absolute sanctuary of the watch cabin together, stepping out into the brutal reality of the northern frontier. Nikolai Valerius did not offer her a blade or a shield. The northern ruler understood implicitly that her very existence, her awakened bloodline, was the greatest arsenal the frozen wastes had ever harbored. Before crossing the threshold, he had draped the massive wolfskin cloak over her shoulders once more. The heavy obsidian fur settled around her small frame with a grounding, physical weight, carrying the deeply intoxicating aroma of crushed pine and wood smoke. It was the exact same garment that had saved her life 30 days ago. Now, however, it did not feel like a desperate shelter for a dying runaway. It felt like a royal mantle. The winter blizzard howled as they moved toward the gorge, the wind shrieking through the jagged mountain passes with a mindless, lethal fury that sought to tear the breath from their lungs. Yet the brutal cold no longer penetrated Iverin's marrow. Deep within her chest, the newly awakened light magic hummed a steady, resonant frequency. It acted as an internal furnace, projecting a microscopic aura of golden heat that melted the sharp granules of ice before they could even strike her eyelashes. Her inner wolf walked beside her conscious mind, no longer pacing or whimpering in the dark. The instinctual beast held its head high, its tail steady, completely synchronized with the primal, protective gravity of the sovereign walking at her side. The stone bridge of Ashenir loomed ahead, a stark frost-rimed silhouette of ancient masonry spanning the terrifying abyss. The northern garrison had already assembled to meet the threat. They did not blow blaring horns or shout, frantic, disorganized orders like the chaotic southern armies. The warriors of the frozen waste stood in absolute, terrifying silence. Hundreds of heavily furred soldiers lined the elevated battlements and the sheer cliff faces, their storm-grey cloaks blending perfectly with the swirling whiteout. They were a living extension of the mountain itself, their hands resting loosely on the leather hilts of their broadswords, their breathing shallow and disciplined. Jarek Thorne stood at the exact center of the stone archway, his analytical eyes scanning the southern approach through the blinding snow. The scout stepped aside as his monarch approached, bowing his head in deep, unwavering respect. He did not just bow to Nikolai. His sharp gaze flicked to Everin, and he lowered his chin a fraction more. It was a silent, profound acknowledgement of the power she carried, a validation from a man who respected nothing but sheer survival. Through the dense, violent curtain of the blizzard, the vanguard of the Oakhaven High Guard finally emerged. The sight was a grotesque, tragic parody of military might. 300 southern infantrymen trudged up the winding mountain pass, their formations sloppy, their heads bowed against the relentless northern gale. Their heavy plate armor, meticulously designed to gleam under the warm southern sun, was entirely coated in a thick, suffocating layer of rime ice. The metal was actively freezing to their padded gambesons, stiffening their joints and reducing their march to a synchronized, agonizing shuffle. The crimson banners of their kingdom, once symbols of vibrant prosperity, were frozen stiff, snapping wildly in the wind like fractured bones. At the center of the decaying column rode Robert Vance. He sat atop a massive dark warhorse, but he looked nothing like a king. The physical deterioration of the man was staggering. His velvet tunic was stiff with frost, his face drawn and violently, hollowed out by 30 days of severe biological starvation. The toxic, corrosive agony of the severed fated mate bond had eaten away his muscle mass, leaving him trembling uncontrollably in the leather saddle. His mud-brown eyes were bloodshot, wide with a frantic, animalistic panic that bordered on pure madness. He was sweating despite the sub-zero temperatures, the sick moisture freezing instantly against his pale temples. He looked like a hollowed-out corpse desperately clinging to a stolen, rusting crown. Garrett Finch was nowhere to be seen in the ranks. The cruel huntsman had likely succumbed to his severe frostbite weeks ago, or perhaps he had simply deserted a dying monarch. Robert pulled his exhausted horse to a halt 10 yards from the southern edge of the bridge. His men fanned out sluggishly, their hands numb and clumsy, as they fumbled to draw their frozen steel swords. In the center of their front line, dragged forward by 2 shivering guards, lay a heavy pile of thick iron shackles. They had brought the chains. They fully intended to drag her back by the throat. The dungeons were where you went to be forgotten, and Robert intended to bury her magic in the dark to sustain his fragile power. The Southern King stared across the narrow expanse of the gorge. Through the swirling snow, he saw the towering, immovable silhouette of Nikolai Valerius, standing beneath the ancient stone archway, and then his frantic eyes locked onto her. Eva in Eld was not cowering in the shadows. She was not kneeling in the frost, weeping for forgiveness. She stood perfectly upright at the absolute edge of the northern boundary, the heavy wolfskin cloak billowing around her legs. Her spine was straight, her chin lifted, her storm-grey eyes fixed onto her former abuser with a chilling, absolute calm. She did not look like the broken, wolfless Omega he had discarded for political convenience. She looked like a queen of the winter dawn, untouchable and supreme. "Everin!" Robert shouted, his voice cracking pathetically, entirely stripped of its usual manipulative honey. The desperate sound was immediately swallowed by the howling wind, forcing him to spur his hesitant horse a few paces closer to the precipice. "Everin, you must return. The southern barrier is gone. The crops are dead in the dirt, the rivers are frozen solid. You are my property, and your absence is destroying the realm." He did not offer an apology. He did not express a single ounce of remorse for the public humiliation or for the shattered ring he had left on the polished stone floor. He only demanded the return of his stolen utility. Nikolai shifted his weight. The movement was incredibly slight, just a tightening of his broad shoulders, but the sheer, crushing dominance that rolled off the Northern King hit the southern ranks like a physical shockwave. Several of the Oakhaven horses whinnied in sheer terror, violently backing away from the bridge and nearly trampling the infantrymen behind them. "She belongs to no one," the King of Ashnir rumbled. His voice did not need to shout to carry over the storm. It vibrated directly through the raw stone of the canyon, a deep, tectonic rumble that made the southern soldiers physically flinch. "She crossed this threshold of her own free will. She is under my protection. Turn your dying men around, Robert Vance, or I will bury them all in this pass." Robert's face twisted into an ugly, desperate snarl, his fragile ego shattering against the immovable wall of northern sovereignty. "You are harboring a fugitive of the Oakhaven crown. I am her alpha. I demand you hand her over, or my men will cross that bridge and take her by force." The threat was so profoundly absurd, so utterly disconnected from the tactical reality of the situation, that a low, collective growl rippled through the hundreds of northern warriors lining the cliffs. They did not draw their weapons. They simply waited for their king to authorize the slaughter. Nikolai did not touch his blade. He simply stared at the shivering southern monarch with an expression of absolute terrifying pity. "Your men cannot even hold their swords, boy. If you step onto this bridge, you will not leave it." Robert grabbed the heavy iron chain from the nearest soldier, holding it aloft with a trembling, frost-bitten hand. "Iverin, the bond demands it. You will anchor the magic, or I will see you dragged behind this horse, all the way back to the keep." Iverson stared at the chains. She did not flinch. She simply stepped out from behind the protective bulk of the northern sovereign. Nikolai did not stop her. He did not grab her arm or try to pull her back into the safety of his shadow. He actively restrained his own roaring instinct to execute the man threatening her, deliberately stepping aside to offer her the absolute, unhindered space to face her tormentor. The young woman walked to the very center of the stone bridge. The biting wind whipped her dark hair round her face, but she did not blink. "You rejected the bond, Robert," Iverin spoke. Her voice was not loud, but it carried that same strange, resonant frequency she had discovered in the watch cabin. It sliced cleanly through the shrieking gale, reaching the ears of every single southern soldier. "You stood before your entire court and declared me empty. You told them I was a dead weight. I made a political calculation." The southern king screamed, his breath plumbing in frantic, ragged clouds. "Clara was supposed to bring military strength, but the magic followed you. You hid your power from me. I hid nothing, she replied, her tone perfectly even, completely devoid of the hysterical tears he so desperately needed to see to validate his dominance. You were simply too obsessed with looking at crowns to notice the earth beneath your feet. You threw away the anchor because you wanted a weapon, and now you are freezing. She glanced at the heavy iron chain in his trembling grip, the ultimate symbol of absolute subjugation. You came here to put me in chains, Everin continued, her inner wolf stepping forward in her mind, baring its teeth not in senseless aggression, but in pure, unyielding defense. You thought I would cower. You thought I would beg for your mercy, but I am not used, not owned, chosen. Robert let out a guttural roar of pure impotent frustration. He kicked his heavy silver spurs brutally into the sides of his exhausted warhorse, attempting to charge onto the ancient masonry of the bridge. The southern soldiers, driven by the sheer terror of their sovereign's panic, let out a ragged, pathetic battle cry and stumbled forward, raising their frozen swords into the storm. Nikolai's hand went instantly to the hilt of his massive blade, his knuckles turning bone-white as his muscles locked to intercept the charge. But Ivarin did not wait for the Northern King to save her. She planted her bare hands flat against the icy stone of the bridge's balustrade. She closed her eyes, seeking the deep, resonant spark of pure warmth within her sternum. She did not reach for anger. She did not reach for vengeance or the desire to destroy. She reached for the absolute, undeniable sovereignty of her own existence. She breathed it forward. A blinding concussive shockwave of pure molten gold energy erupted from her small frame. It did not explode with the violent, destructive force of a feral beast. It expanded with the unstoppable, crushing weight of a continental shift. The golden luminescence swept across the stone bridge in a terrifying rush, instantly melting the centuries of packed ice and vaporizing the falling snow into a massive, towering cloud of hissing steam. The shockwave slammed into the charging southern vanguard. It did not burn their flesh. Instead, the ancient light magic, specifically, targeted the corrupt, aggressive intent of Oakhaven. The heavy iron chain in Robert's hand suddenly glowed white-hot, snapping into a dozen brittle pieces that crumbled into fine grey ash before they even hit the slush. The frozen steel swords of the infantrymen shattered violently in their hands, the blades dissolving into harmless, rusted dust. The iron breastplates and chain that bound them cracked and fell away, snapping at the rivets, leaving the entire army completely disarmed, unburdened, and entirely exposed to the biting wind. Robert's warhorse reared violently, terrified by the sudden eruption of blinding light. The exhausted animal bucked, throwing the Southern King backward out of the saddle. Robert Vance hit the frozen earth with a sickening, heavy thud. The heavy gold crown dislodged from his head, rolling through the melting slush and coming to a dead stop directly at the edge of the bridge, mere inches from the abyss. Everin opened her eyes. The golden light continued to radiate softly from her skin, casting long, stark shadows across the canyon. The blizzard directly above them had been temporarily blasted away, revealing a vast patch of bruised purple sky. She stared down at the pathetic, disarmed monarch groveling in the mud. He was gasping for air, clutching his chest as the final, lingering threads of their biological connection were permanently, irrevocably incinerated by her magic. He was no longer her alpha. He was absolutely nothing. A name unspoken for 5 years grows teeth, my king, Ivarin whispered, quoting the brutal reality of the wilderness she had learned. But a bond rejected in malice leaves you with no teeth at all. She turned her back on him. She did not offer a final insult. She did not wait for his pathetic response. The ultimate punishment was her complete and total indifference. She walked slowly back toward the northern archway, the heavy wolfskin cloak trailing behind her like a royal train. Robert lay in the freezing mud, his hands desperately clawing at the dirt. He stared at the rolling crown, then at the retreating back of the woman who held the literal heartbeat of his kingdom. He tried to speak, tried to beg her to come back, but his throat was locked in a spasm of absolute, suffocating terror. The physical realization of his ruin crashed down upon him. He had no weapons. He had no magic. He had an army of freezing, unarmed men who were already turning around, abandoning their fallen king in the mud to begin the long, agonizing death march back to a doomed valley. He had thrown away the warmth, and now the winter would consume him. Nikolai Valerius stood at the threshold, watching the southern forces break and scatter. He did not order his men to pursue. The powerful Alpha simply looked down at the broken man in the mud, his storm-grey eyes reflecting the absolute lack of mercy the northern wastes were known for. "Do not ever look toward my borders again." Nikolai's voice echoed through the canyon, a final lethal decree that sealed the fate of the south. The northern sovereign turned and fell into step beside Ivarin. The massive stone gates of the inner keep, hidden just beyond the pass, began to grind open with a heavy, welcoming groan, ready to receive their true queen. By the time they returned to the absolute sanctuary of the watch cabin, the adrenaline of the confrontation had faded, replaced by a deep, profound exhaustion. But it was not the frantic, hyper-vigilant fatigue she had carried for years in Oakhaven. It was the heavy, incredibly satisfying tiredness of a war permanently won. The hearth fire was still burning fiercely, casting its rich, molten gold light across the circular stone room. The small patch of vibrant green mountain grass still thrived near the chimney, a permanent, living testament to her awakening. Ivarin sat quietly on the edge of the soft mattress. Nikolai knelt before her once again. He did not ask for a kingdom in return for his protection. He did not demand her submission or attempt to leverage the fact that she had just dismantled an army. He simply reached for the heavy clay jar of hearth oil, his massive, scarred hands moving with that same impossible, painstaking gentleness as he checked the faint, silvery scars on her fully healed feet. "The southern armies will not return," he murmured, his thumb brushing lightly over her ankle. The sudden, grounding jolt of static electricity snapped between them again, rushing up her spine. But this time, neither of them pulled away. Ivarin looked down at the powerful, dangerous protector who was willing to humble himself entirely for her safety. He had spent life preparing to rule a frozen wasteland alone, convinced his lethal aura would only frighten people and bring isolation. She had spent her life conditioned to believe she was too broken, too empty to ever be worthy of safe, unconditional touch. "I know," she said quietly. Her inner wolf finally rested its heavy head against his presence, completely domesticated by his unwavering respect. "They have nowhere left to run." He lifted his head, his striking eyes shifting to molten gold in the firelight, completely unguarded. "And you, Ivarin Eld, are you still running?" She reached out, her small fingers tracing the harsh, angular line of his jaw. The contact was incredibly warm, anchoring them both in the quiet domestic space they had fought so fiercely to protect. "No," she whispered. "I think I have finally stopped. The thawing, the people of the northern wastes would say for generations to come, was not just about the shifting of the weather. It was about a terrifying king who learned to offer absolute patience, and a quiet queen who taught him how to build a sanctuary. It was about breaking the corrupt iron chains of the South and choosing warmth over cold, hope over fear, and love over duty. The quiet watch cabin in the high country still stands, its chimney smoke rising steadily against the grey sky. They say a massive king still chops the wood, and a radiant queen still heals the broken. If this story warmed your hearth, and you believe that true power lies in the quiet dignity of a survivor, please like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments below. Join our sanctuary and witness more underdogs claim their crown.